Thank you very much, Mike. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very good to see all of you here tonight. And what we're here for tonight is, in fact, is to launch this booklet. See the title on the screen. Dinna Forget, the Memoirs of Kirkcudbright District and Beyond by John McKee, RN. So what we're going to do this evening really is to introduce you to, first of all, the man himself, a very interesting character. He was the original, the very first curator of the Stewartry Museum across the road. And in fact, he was one of the co-founders of the original Stewartry Museum, which was in the top floor of the Old Town Hall, now occupied by the Mitchell Gallery in Kirkcudbright Galleries. So I have a sort of connection with him through my job, or my former job. And my colleague this evening has another connection with him, a little bit more closer, in that Donald is the great-great-grandson of John McKee. So who better to read from John's writings, which are published in this book. These are the memoirs of John McKee, which he wrote in 1905. So we've published them in 2025, so it's taken 120 years to get to this point, but I hope you'll find it's well worth it. And this evening, for the first time, we're selling the booklet. Ian at the back of the hall has got copies at the special price for you this evening of £5, discount of £1, and I'm sure you'll find that great value. So I'm going to say a little bit about the author, John McKee, first, and then go on to talk about the book. The two are very much intertwined. So John the man, and if we look at start off with his family. There's our John in the middle there, born 1821, 1915. Son of James McKee and Grace Charters. Now, his father James was a tenant farmer, had a lease of the farm at Nunton, High Nunton, at the back of the Doon, so we're in Twynham parish. Before then, his father had farmed in Tungland, in fact. And John was the second son of the family of five, the three girls and two boys. His brother Thomas, over there on the left, trained as a minister, and for a while was served in the parish of Monarchy near Dundee, and then moved down to Erskine in Renfrewshire, just the other side of Erskine Bridge. That was his parish. And being the eldest son, quite a lot of money was spent on him in training and getting him through university, the theology degree. And when it came to John's turn, he was, as we'll see, quite an ambitious, quite a talented model maker, good at mathematics. But there wasn't really the same funds available to put John through an apprenticeship as a mechanical engineer. He would have loved to have gone to Glasgow to work in one of the new foundries or the new engineering works, which were opening up in the 1840s in Glasgow at that time. John married twice. He had three sisters, we should mention, Helen, Grace, and Margaret. He married twice. Margaret Bell was a childhood sweetheart. Her father farmed originally at Port Mary in Rerrick Parish, and then moved into Kirkcudbright itself and actually had a bakery in Union Street. She died in 1871, and that was a very bad year for John, because if you look at the dates, he lost his mother in 1871, he lost his brother Thomas in 1871, his first wife Margaret, and his young son, 2-year-old Cuthbert, that year as well. Perhaps not surprising that he retired from the Navy the next year as well, so 1872. With Margaret Bell, he had 4 sons, Norman, Flora, Grace, also known as Daisy, and Cuthbert. And Donald's side of the family actually descends from Grace, who died in 1929. So there it is, the man himself. This is probably a photograph taken outside the Stewardship Museum, around about 1900. It's actually from an article, a little biography of him in the Galavidian magazine of that year. And I suspect he's standing at the corner of the museum, sort of the near corner here, where there's still a little metal gate. Can you see he's holding the gate there? I must go and look at the masonry, but I think that's where he's standing there. The memoirs deal a lot with his early years. The first 79 pages of the 445-page memoir that he left deal with his early years. And these are quite fascinating about life in rural Galloway at the time. Nunton is in the southern part of Twynham parish, so it's almost, go over the Doon Hill and you're onto the Doon Beach area, Nunmill Bay. And Borg is the Borg-Twynham boundary is adjacent really to Nunton Farm. So in fact, our John went to Borg Academy for his education. And but there's a lot in that first 79 pages of the memoirs about growing up in that area. There's lots about superstition. There's lots about the neighbours and the various gatherings that they had, weddings, ceremonies, customs, and that sort of thing. We've got an example that Donald's going to read now of an occasion when he's probably about 11 or 12, I think, but it's a memory that he had. He'd, in fact, just broken his arm at Borg Academy. He'd been chasing another boy who was at the Dame School in Borg, the other school in Borg, and had almost caught him, but the boy went into the main door of the Dame School, and John was going at such a pace that he put his hand up on the side of the door to stop himself and managed to break his arm that way. So, that's why little boys shouldn't really run around school, should they? They could break their arm. Yeah. But anyway, Donald.
Thank you. These personal recollections of individuals have led me away from a mishap which befell me a day or two after my arm was set. The whole household went to the moss to fit peats. This operation consisted of setting them on end in groups to dry. When dug out of the bank, they are quite soft and could not be stood on end. They are therefore first spread on the ground and allowed to remain for a week or so, the length of time depending on the state of the weather, until they were sufficiently hardened to allow of their being stood on end in groups of a dozen or so. This was called first fitting. The next process was to put them into larger piles with the other ends up, which was called turn fitting. It was one of these operations they were all at when I was told by your grandmother to turn 3 pigs, which had followed, to prevent their getting among the peats. They, pig-like, objected to being turned, and in racing after them, I was hampered with having my arm in the sling, which led to my stumbling right into a peat hole, which was full of water. I was dragged out wet and smeared with glaur, taken home and put to bed. The millboard casing on my arm was softened through being wet, and I was in sad trouble, both from being kept in bed and the discomfort of the limp arm. Next day, your grandmother took me to Dr. McDowell, who bandaged it afresh as tight as before. I have still a lively recollection of the torture I endured through my hand being so tightly squeezed by the bandaging. The weather being warm soon caused scalding between my fingers, which were almost stuck together through it, which made me most uncomfortable and restless. I yet mind the relief I got when your Auntie Nell managed to work pieces of rag between my fingers with the blade of a knife.
Thank you, Donald. This next slide shows the location of the farm. This is High Nunton. here. And there's the dune beach down here, just to get the Nun Mill here, of course. And you can see the proximity of Borg Academy. And he would walk through the fields to the academy every day for school. And across the river, you've got the St Mary's Isle, the mansion, St Mary's Isle. So most of the land on either side of the Dee at this time was part of the St Mary's Isle estate, a huge estate at that time. As well as we've heard an incident with the peat fitting and digging for the peat. At this time, you might think they would have access to wood to burn in the farm, but no, that was strictly off limits. You couldn't touch the woodland of your landlord, so you were digging peats for fuel for the winter, and well, for all the year, really. As the book goes on to describe a lot of the experience that John had at Borg Academy, but he broadens out, and we hear about other events happening in Borg, Twynham parish, but also in Kirkcudbright. There's a lot of hunting goes on, and the boys, all the boys in the two parishes, follow the hounds for the hunting. There's some interesting observations of wildlife. For example, there's an awful lot of polecats around at that time. This is before there was active gamekeeping in the area. So there's lots of foxes. There's wildcats in Sennick Wood, for example. There was a story that about the wool cat, as they called it in Sennick Woods. This was a mythical large beast which you really didn't want to go into Sennick Wood for. You might be caught by the wool cat. Nobody had ever seen it, but it was one of these local superstitions. One particularly interesting event which he describes is the first Kirkcudbright Regatta, which was held in 1836 on the River Dee. Coming up from Kirkcudbright, the races were upriver from Kirkcudbright, and as I say, one of the significant event, because his father was quite friendly with his school teacher at Borg. John was given permission to take the day off from school and attend the regatta, where the rest of the class weren't. So he had a special privilege there. And there's a lovely description of this event, the very first regatta of many which followed after 1836.
To come back to the regatta day at school, he granted my request without hesitation. The moment I got out, I started for home at my utmost speed. They had all gone to the regatta except your grandmother, and I am sure I must have given her a start, rushing in all hurry and excitement to be off again. I got something to eat, which I bolted with all dispatch while getting into my Sunday clothes, and with a piece in my hand started. I did not let any grass grow under my feet, you may be sure. When I reached the top of Newton Hill and came in sight of the boats, gay with flags, and the great crowds along the bank of the river, it made the grandest display I have ever seen. Nearly all those from Borg and Twynham remained on their side of the river. Lady Anne Murray's band was stationed on the Twynham side. I had never seen or heard a band play before, and thought it just splendid. There would be about a dozen or 15 bandsmen. They were tastefully dressed in blue, piped with white. As they all belonged to Gatehouse, a large number from that district came with them. There never had been such a crowd seen in Kirkcudbright before. The weather was all that could be desired, and the novelty of the affair proved a great attraction. There were a number of boats belonging to men employed in the two shipbuilding yards at the time, besides those belonging to fishermen and coasting vessels. But with the exception of a 6-oared gig, which I believe belonged to William Gordon, Procurator Fiscal, at least it was always kept in his boathouse, none of them were built for racing. John Finlay, the distiller, had a boat specially designed and built by John Murray, the joiner. It could hardly be called a four-oared gig, though it was finer in lines than any of the other boats. It was painted white, and the name Spectre, manned by the Wisharts, and it won every prize for which it competed. I could not tell how many races there were, but I mind one was won by a canoe belonging to Sir John Gordon, who had not then been long in Borg. I was close beside him when it came in the winner, and though he was very stout, he jumped about and cheered until purple in the face. The yeoman cavalry being embodied at the time, their handsome uniform with large silver scales on the shoulders brightened up the gathering. They were an exceptionally fine body of men. I have seen their measurements. Very few of them were under 5 feet 8 inches in height, and the great majority were from 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet.
So John leaves school at the age of 17, leaves Borg Academy at 17. He then, as I say, he would have really liked to have followed a career in mechanical engineering. There was obviously no question of him going into farming at this time. Possibly, his father didn't recommend it, although his farmer was a very successful farmer and a recognized specialist in handling cattle. In the absence of vets, it was James McKee you sent for if you had a problem with your cattle or your dairy cow. So he went to be a millwright, which was, if you like, the next best thing. You're not talking about steam power, you're talking about the old-fashioned water power. And he served his apprenticeship with John Bennett at Fagra Mill, who was the leading millwright at the time. It was Bennett who built the sawmill at Mute Hill after one particular bad storm one year, which blew down a lot of trees on the St Mary's Isle estate. And the Earl of Selkirk decided, well, what we're going to do with all these trees, I better build a sawmill to cut them up into all sorts of things. And that was built as a result of that. He completes his apprenticeship in 5 years, and still pursues his ambition to go into engineering works and foundries. And he visits his brother, who's still at Monarchy near Dundee, and a parishioner there actually gets him a job in one of the Dundee works at the time. And thereafter he spends a couple of years really working first at Dundee, and then a friend who worked with him at Fagra Mill told him about work at Liverpool, and where he gets twice the pay rate he was receiving at Dundee. So he goes down to Liverpool, and then he works on 2 ships there, and then when those are completed, he goes to Eccles in Greater Manchester and works on a steam hammer production works, and then finally goes to Crewe to the locomotive works of the London and North Western Railway Company there. But throughout this time, through really the connections that his brother Thomas had with the Countess of Selkirk, he gets an introduction to Captain Falcon, who at that time had the estate of Largs in Twynham, but was still in the Royal Navy, and he was the captain of the Pembroke Dockyard. And it's through this introduction that John eventually gets into the Navy. He's given some practical experience by Captain Falcon, and then he's put forward for the engineering exams for the Royal Navy. So in 1847, we find him in the Navy. I'll come back to that one. And he serves 25 years in the Navy, in fact, beginning as a second engineer and rising through the ranks to eventually chief engineer. And his very last ship was HMS Sultan. And this was one of the Navy's top ironclad battleships, state of the art. And John is the chief engineer, responsible not just for the engines, which are blazing away, as you can see from the funnels, but in fact he's responsible for all the mechanical apparatus within the ship, as well as the stores necessary to maintain the running of the ship properly. But in between times, or before then, he also has a spell of service on the Royal Yacht, not the Britannia at that time, but Her Majesty's Yacht, Victoria and Albert. He sees service in the West African Squadron, which is there to intercept slave ships leaving the west coast of Africa, heading for Brazil and America. He's involved in the First and Second Crimean War with Russia, but not actually in Crimea in the Black Sea, but in the Baltic. There is some activity. The Navy went to the Baltic to confront the Russians there as well. After 10 years in the Navy, he marries his childhood sweetheart Margaret, and is also able to settle his parents, his by this time aging parents, who are very worried about their future on the farm at Nunton. And in fact, he settles them in Doon Cottage, which is, you might know it, overlooking, it's just over the bridge as you come to the Doon. The building in the middle there, this is a postcard of 1885, that was Doon Cottage in 1885, which was actually built for the school teacher who ran the school, which is the building to the left of the central building there. This was a girls' school which was started up by the Earl and Countess of Selkirk. But that was Doon Cottage in 1885. In fact, the Doon Cottage that I think his parents went to was this ruined building, which is no longer there. You can see the bridge and Nun Mill just in the background here as well. So he's in a position to support his parents in that way, and that's a great relief to them in their old age. So he settles his parents at the Doon. I think you've seen already that from Donald's readings that there's a lot of interesting coverage of life in the area at this time, and this book, I should say, came about really when the History Society, your society, received a copy of the original 5 books of his memoirs, which are actually in the National Library in Edinburgh. And when we looked at them, I think we realized that there was so much of interest, of local history interest, that really it would be a great thing to publish them for current and future local history research. Now, a lot of the that's done it. A lot of the book is in fact about his naval career. So of the 445 pages, roughly 2/3 of those are about his naval career, which is very interesting, but maybe not quite within our remit as a society. So what we've done is to just print all the local material in full and abridge the naval history. So the story, the narrative is there, but not in quite the same detail as the local material. If I haven't said so, the copy that we got in the society was very kindly donated by Bud Gordon. It had been part of the late Jimmy Gordon's library, and the other very positive thing and encouraging thing about it was that Donald's family had a copy as well, and his mother, Mary Grace Bradley in Canada, had actually produced a transcription of the whole thing. So really everything was falling in our favour to look at a publication. And then we managed to get some support from the Galloway Association of Glasgow for about 2/3 of the printing costs. So really everything was falling into place for our publication project. And then, of course, we have to thank the 15 members of the society who very kindly took a number of pages from the original copies and researched information, researched further details about the various stories which are represented in there. So when you see the book, you'll find the full transcript of the local material anyway, but there's over 300 footnotes which explain particular points about individuals mentioned, or things like the regatta, when it started, and that sort of thing. So all in all, I hope it's going to be a very good local history source in the years to come. There's also an index both to the local material and also to naval history as well, his naval career, as well as things like a timeline and a number of illustrations that you'll see as well. So it's, we think, a work of considerable historical value locally. There aren't many accounts like this. This literally tells his story from about 1821 when he's born, through to 1905 when he's writing it. Interestingly, there's very little about his experience of working in the Stewardship Museum or developing that. But I think that's because he's writing this for his son Norman, who was probably very well aware of, if you like, the recent history of his father. So there was nothing new of that. You can imagine Norman badgering his father to write down his experiences, his reminiscences, before it was too late. And of course, in 1905, he was 83, was John. And if I have the same memory as his, if I get to 83, I'll be delighted, because his recall is tremendous, I think. So I'd like to again give you another, Donald's going to read you another quote, which takes us a little bit outside our local area. We've had a quote from the farm, if you like, or a quote from what's going on in Kirkcudbright with the regatta. This describes the journey he took to see his brother Thomas in Dundee in 1845. This is after he's finished his apprenticeship as a millwright, and for the first time he's going to Dumfries. You've got to remember, these people didn't really travel far. To go to Castle Douglas or Dalbeattie was quite an excursion. Gatehouse was quite close. Gatehouse and Kirkcudbright were quite well known to the people in that part of Twynham, Bore parish, but a trip to Castle Douglas was a rarity, or Dalbeattie, and Dumfries was really the other side of the world. But this describes a long, long journey he was taking from Kirkcudbright to Dundee.
I was the only outside passenger and consequently occupied the box seat beside the driver. The advantage this seat possessed over the others being that it had an apron which protected the occupant's legs from cold and rain. The day, 4th of March 1845, was cold and dry, and I enjoyed the drive to Dumfries, having never been in a vehicle with springs before, my coaching experience being limited to a farm cart with a sackful of straw for the seat. I was met at the coach office by a Robert Ferguson, a sort of distant relation, your grandmother and his father being second cousins. He had booked my seat for the next day in the mail coach to Edinburgh, which started from the King's Arms Inn. I cannot now tell the exact hour at which it left, but recollect it was just grey daylight, so it must have been about 6 a.m. There were several passengers whose names were on the waybill, but mine was not included, which put me in a fluster. They were very particular in those days about the names on the waybill being correct, and had it not been for the driver of the Kirkcudbright coach, who, being present, got hold of it and saw that Robert Ferguson, whom he knew, had given his own name when booking the seat instead of giving mine, and thereby accounted for the mistake. They did not alter the waybill, so that I remained Mr. Ferguson from Dumfries to Edinburgh. I was greatly taken by the skill of the driver, it being the first time I had ever seen four in hand, and was surprised to see with what precision he could touch up the leaders with the whiplash at full length and the wheelers with the bite of it. But long before reaching Edinburgh, I was colder than I have ever been either before or since. I had a thin greatcoat, called in those days a taglione, but it did not give much protection, so that I was chilled to the very heart. The coach stopped at the Black Bull Inn at the top of Leith Street. I had been recommended to go to a tavern in Hanover Street, kept by a Twynham man named Houston. But as I was going to leave the next day for Dundee by the steam packet from Granton, and the bus taking the passengers to her started near the Black Bull, I thought it best to stop in the neighbourhood and went to an inn close by, which the driver of the De Vries coach recommended. It was a very comfortable place, and as I was perished with cold, thought I would have a beefsteak and potatoes to warm me. But in putting a hot potato into my mouth, every tooth in my head ached madly for a little through the sudden change of temperature. I had a comfortable enough bed, but never warmed in it all night. I forget what I had for breakfast, but got to the steamer in good time.
So yes, he gets on the steamer at Granton and thinks, oh, this is great. In the Forth, it's like a very lovely voyage, the calm. But the minute he gets out into the open sea, it's sickness, seasickness all round. And like everybody else on the steam packet, he suffers until they get into the River Tay at Dundee there. I think we've broken this. I've broken this. Yeah. Next one. Oh, other way, I think, is it? Yeah. That's it. Yeah. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but after his career in the Navy, he retires, as I've said, and comes back to Kirkcudbright and eventually builds Anchor Lee, which I'm sure you recognise next to St Mary's Garage, as his house. Good choice of name, I suppose, Anchor Lee. And next one, is it so? Yeah. No, that's fine. And so on. And it's from here, almost certainly, he writes the memoirs that we're talking about tonight. In Kirkcudbright and elsewhere, of course, another topic which comes up an awful lot in the work is drinking, alcohol, and public houses, which, believe it or not, there were 33 within the borough at this time. And not only in the borough, but on every road that you went out of town, whether it's to Mute Hill, Tonglen, Twynham, there were 2, 3, or 4 more. And the next extract is going to describe that. There's a lot of... It's obviously a very controversial thing at this time, because this is when the teetotalism and the temperance movements are starting up. And there's a lot of discussion about the various merits of alcohol or not within it. So, Donald, let's hear about some pubs.
Good timing. Well done. Being again in Kirkcudbright, the sight of the places familiar to me in my boyhood and youth recalled to my memory many incidents which in those days had occurred. It's hardly possible with your present-day knowledge to give you a clear idea of the condition then existing when there were over 300 more inhabitants in the borough with little more than half the house accommodation. There was then 2 shipbuilding yards, 2 tanneries, a soapery, and, though it be spoken, 33 public houses, the latter affording proof that the title of Whisky Jean was not misapplied. The public house was not the only means of livelihood possessed by the majority of those who kept them. The prevailing custom was for the husband to continue at his trade or calling and leave the management of the liquor business to his wife. It was rather a risky arrangement in thus placing the household under the control of the weaker vessel, who in some cases became the chief breadwinner. When this occurred, the good man gradually slided into obscurity, and the wife became the ruling power. It is recorded of one, when filling up a census paper, entered herself as the head of the family. In the column for business or profession, she put innkeeper. She entered her husband as John, my man. For business or profession, she put, he just doits about and does nothing. There being thus ample provision for the drouthy lieges within the borough, while beyond the borough roods, as the municipal boundary was then usually called, they had not far to go either way until they came to Jean Guthrie's at the Mute Hill or Nicky Mitchell's at Tungland Toll Bar. There was often heated controversy between frequenters of the one or the other. Jean was held to keep the best liquor, while Nicky had 4 dashing daughters, noted for their pungent jibes when bantering with the usual frequenters from the borough. One of them gave Colonel Kennedy Laurie of Woodhall, whose private reputation was not beyond reproach, a thorough rebuff. He had used a licentious expression as she approached to collect the toll. On seeing her look of disgust, he threw a crown piece on the road and told her to take the toll out of it, which she did, and calmly counted the change in his sight so that he might see it was correct. She then pitched it down where he had thrown the crown, and without a word turned and walked into the house. As there was no one else about, it was a sad blow to his dignity having to dismount and pick up the coin. To add to his annoyance, the occurrence became public, and he knew he was getting laughed at.
So you can see there's quite a variety of stories and incidents which really do, I think, underline the value of these memoirs, which have cover such a long period, from his early days in the 1820s right up to 1905, and the last 10 years of his life. He died in 1915. In many ways, it covers a period of great change in Scotland and England, when he's talking about superstitions and belief in the devil and this sort of thing in his childhood and teens. But yet, as we may see, that by the end of the period, he's actually travelling to Canada by on one of the Anchor Line ships sailing out of Glasgow, the weekly service from Glasgow to New York. And it's such a we go from almost medieval superstition to modernity in the space of his lifetime, and therefore in his memoirs. And there was another, actually, a bonus that we weren't really expecting in these memoirs, in that he quotes actually a long series of, a poem written by James May, who we know very little about. It's a satirical poem about what was Kirkcudbright's social event of the year, and that's the Kirkcudbrightshire Gentlemen and Yeomanry Cavalry Ball. They've been mentioned already in connections with the regatta. They were on horseback either side of the river, with their bright uniforms and their silver scales. Donald's mentioned these men already. These are very often farmers' sons, farmers. The Earl of Selkirk was actually a member of the local troop as well. But Donald's going to read some verses from it, which describe, sometimes rather unkindly, some of the leading figures of the town in the day. So it's satirical. John mentions that there was talk of taking James May to court because of his libelous statements about people, but This was just on the eve of the Reform Act, the Reform Bill of 1832, the Parliamentary Reform Bill. And he says, oh, there was so much hoo-ha about that all these intentions to sue the man were sort of forgotten, and it was left to pass over. So these are some verses from the poem on the Kirkcudbright gentleman in Yeomanry Cavalry Ball, probably written in 1830 or 1831.
This is just 3 of these verses, following a description of 3 characters that is named. See, bold Jemmy Hornell comes nearing looking braggart, his pockets stuffed with sugar plums and love with Miss MacTaggart. And do you see the provost stare with looks devoid of reason, moving as graceful as a bear with new elastic stays on? And there is old Bob Cannon too, with vast importance big, tripping the light fantastic toe as graceful as a pig. I think his partner is Miss Caig, fat, fair, and more than 50, Lord Selkirk's quondam kitchen maid, grown rich by being thrifty. And there is pretty Miss McGowan, with feathers in her hair, the richest lassie in the town, with £40 a year. And there is Black the draper too, with what brings him here, I wonder, dressed in a fine new suit of blue and looking black as thunder. That was just 3 of those verses. It describes Miss MacTaggart, better known as Jeanie Taggart. The Mick being nearly always dropped in this name, was a dashing, handsome lass with a ready tongue that drove the young farmers who came sweethearting to the verge of distraction. She made but a poor catch in the end when she married Bob Cunningham, then in Lincoln's, but getting into financial difficulties. He took badly to liquor and was eventually drowned in the Dee. She lived to a good age and died in the house of one of her daughters in Kirkcudbright. He next mentions a Miss Caig. I don't know anything about her antecedents. She had an old duffer of a brother she called Jemmy. She lived in Castle Street in what is now the ice cream shop. Finally, Miss McGowan. I am not sure which of the McGowans is meant, but from her having feathers in her hair, I think it must be Annie, who was very continental, being a poetess. She published a volume of her poems. I got a copy, which must still be about the house. They were somewhat weak, inspirations that had come to her. It might be on seeing a butterfly settling on a rosebud, or perhaps a bee sucking honey from a humble flower when she would enlarge on one getting sweets, while from the same plant another would get only scratches. I believe a former minister of Dalry would be her grandfather.
Thank you, Donald. So there's a lot more of that and of the poem in the book, and very helpfully, John has written these little biographical notes to follow the poem. So we hear about a little bit of detail about these people who we wouldn't know much about anyway, but we get some idea of the society of Kirkcudbright at the time. And as I say, we're in the 1830s at this time. Probably the dances were taking place either in the top floor of the Masonic, or they could even have been in the toll booth at this time, but he doesn't mention exactly where they were. So finally, I'd like to end with an account of the trip to Canada, which I mentioned. John's second wife was a Carnacan originally from Gatehouse. She'd married though, and she was a widow herself, and her sister Isabella was housekeeper to her uncle James Halliday at Kirkcudbright in the north end of Twynham parish, and they resolved to go and see their relatives in Canada. And when I read this, it was really quite eye-opening that. As we'll hear, there were so many people from Galloway in this particular part of Ontario when they got there. He recognised people from school, for example, from Borg Academy, and it seemed that most of the population had some Galloway connection or other. So Donald will tell us more about that. I should say the first part describes the voyage, and then the second part is actually the railway journey from New York to Ontario.
It had been a sort of pious belief with Mother and her sister Isabel at Kirkcudbright that sometime or other they would get to Canada and see their full and half brothers and sisters, of which there was a large family. On the strength of the recommendation that Mother and I would be benefited by a long journey, we brought up the old design of visiting Canada. After talking it over and discussing all the pros and cons with Isabel, who, having always had her own way at Kirkcudbright, needed some humouring before getting to her to agree to our proposals. When all the arrangements were settled, we took passage into New York in the anchor liner California from Glasgow. It took 10 days to make the passage, but the weather was fine, and there being no seasickness, it was very enjoyable. And then the train portion of the journey. Though long, the journey was not so tiresome as one in the same length of time at home would have been, as the passengers could move about, and there were attendants with trays having different sorts of fruits, biscuits and sweets going the rounds regularly. There were others with books. These they pitched down beside the passengers, came back in an hour, half an hour or so, and picked them up, hoping at the same time to effect a sale. The next long stoppage was at Stratford. On arriving there, we were surprised by a man making a set at us, seizing our hands and shaking them most energetically while welcoming us to Canada. He never thought of telling his name, but on asking, we found it was James Payne, a son of Williams, formerly at Mute Hill, and now a neighbour of the Carnachans. He had been at Stratford on business, being a grain merchant, and knowing we were expected, thought he would have the credit of giving us the first welcome. We got to Seaforth about an hour after leaving Stratford, where about a dozen of the connection were waiting for our arrival and gave us a most cordial reception. After hearty congratulations and countless handshakings, we were driven to James Dixon's, a distance of about 2 miles, but as it was dark, it seemed much longer. For 2 or 3 days, we held what might be termed a levee. There were such a number of callers, nearly the whole district of that being colonised by Gallividians. There were numbers from Borg, Twynham, and adjoining parishes, amongst others, several old schoolmates.
Thank you, Donald. So that was our international section. You know, we go from the parish in the early days of his life, and he's there in Canada, and those second thoughts about the distance. I suppose he's being a seaman, that was quite ordinary for him. So I hope that what we've said about the man and the book has stimulated your interest in his writing, in his memoirs. The last slide. Yeah. And
Sorry.
yes, that's right.
There we go. That's it.
Yeah. And this is the cover of the book. Well, the cover on the front and on the right, the back on the left. And we've actually taken the title. These are his own words, because the title is Dinna Forget, and that's actually on his headstone in the churchyard, in the kirkyard. Dinna Forget. It was erected for his second wife, and then he's appeared, who died before him, and his name is under that, as added to that. But note the form of the memorial. It's actually a compass binnacle, so very appropriate for a former Royal Navy officer. Dinna Forget. And I like to think that his last words there, as he's with us in spirit, I'm sure, is dinna forget to buy my book. Thank you very much.